means that the number one pick in the 2021 NBA draft goes to the Detroit Pistons.
Who's got the number one pick in this year's draft? Who's got the number one pick in this year's draft?
Basketball!
Select Isaiah Stewart.
The Detroit Pistons select Killian Hayes.
Sadiq, that was absolutely sensational.
I don't know what went into that process. I met the criteria to be selected, but I wasn't.
From long range. Oh! Yes!
Detroit basketball! Hello, Pistons fans, and welcome back to another edition of the Palace of Pistons Podcast. Aaron Johnson here with you, stepping into the hosting duties with no Mike Angelano this week, but I am joined by Jasper Apollonia. Jasper, good to have you with me. How you doing?
I'm doing well. We tried to do this podcast a couple days ago. The power lines outside my apartment on my block literally caught fire, exploded and caught fire. So I didn't have Wi-Fi for a couple days there, but we're back, we're good, and we're ready to go. I'm excited, Aaron. Let's get into it.
Yeah, this podcast has been days in the making.
Literally days in the making.
So we're glad that we could finally get together and record. We're going to get into a pretty interesting topic that's really been the buzz of Pistons Twitter for probably the last 2 weeks now, with just some other prospects really picking up steam in terms of guys that Pistons Twitter really seems to be clamoring towards. And if you've been listening to this podcast for a while, we tend to get a lot of our topics from some of the discussion points that we see primarily on Pistons Twitter, outside of like the everyday news that's going on around the team. But we're going to get into that. Before we do, I want to talk about our sponsors today, BetOnline. Our partners at BetOnline continue to be the number one source for all your betting needs and sports info. Find all of the latest odds, news, and sports developments, including this year's basketball championship finals, the NHL Hockey Conference Finals, Major League Baseball, the latest fighting news, and even next season's early NFL futures. Head to the website on your or use your mobile device to sign up today and receive your 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit. Just use our promo code BLEAV, that's BLEAV, to get the bonus and get into the action. Bet online where the game starts. So,
Aaron, do you have any money in?
Last night, and they won. I didn't put any money on it myself. I did prop bets, but I was telling everyone in the world, hey, Boston money line, Boston money line. Boston goes out and they get the job done in game one on the road. Jason Tatum shoots, I think it was 3 for 17 from the field, and Boston goes out on the road in Golden State and takes game one of the NBA Finals. How about that?
Yeah, I mean, well, I will say this, Aaron. If you follow me on Twitter, you know, after the game one of the Brooklyn series, I tweeted out, Boston's going to the finals, and I'm going to hate every second of it. And I've been operating under that assumption ever since. So luckily, no matter who wins this finals, I'm coming out on top one way or another. But yeah, I have to say, I thought Boston was really undervalued by a lot of people coming into this series. And, people want to dog on 538 and their predictions models, but there's a reason that a lot of predictions models like Boston to win this series. And I do too. I think they're probably going to take this thing in 6. So we'll see. I'm going to hate every second of it, no matter what. Don't get me wrong. But yeah, they were fantastic as a team last night. And that's really the thing. I think when you're looking at this finals matchup, you're like, oh, well, the Warriors have so much firepower. They got Steph, they got Clay, they got Poole. Where is, outside of Jalen Brown and Jason Tatum, where's the firepower coming from Boston? And, we've talked about, I said it at the beginning of the playoffs, I really liked the Suns because they reminded me a lot of what the Pistons used to be back when they were going to 6 straight Eastern Conference Finals. They were very similar to that, a really complete team, with some really, really, really high-level all-NBA players, but maybe not that MVP candidate. And Boston, for me, obviously Jason Tatum is more of that MVP caliber. But other than that, it's a full team effort. And you saw that last night because when Jason Tatum wasn't firing, everybody else stepped up to pick him up. And everybody else stepped up to produce. And boy, they dominated that fourth quarter.
So I want to get into our Pistons talk, but I have a question because I've seen it on Twitter a lot over the last few days. Everyone doesn't like Boston, and is that just because it's Boston? Like, I find Jason Tatum, Jalen Brown, Marcus, like I actually really enjoy watching the Celtics, but everyone's seemingly rooting against Boston. What is the story behind it? Is it just their history?
Aaron, it's not what you're seeing on the floor that's the problem. It's when they cut to the stands. That's the problem. Because it's those Boston fans. Oh. I'm telling you, I don't think the rivalry's that great anymore. You know what I mean? Like I think that most people that are Pistons fans don't really even remember the bad boys. But like the fact of the matter is, whenever they cut to the stands, you see some doughy white masshole just high-fiving his tatted up neighbor. And you just want these people to lose with every fiber of your being. They're just horrible to look at. Honestly, that's really what it comes down to. If they didn't cut to the audience, I would actually probably like them. But they make me see Celtics fans, and the second I have to view them, then I'm out. I'm all the way out. It's not about the team. It's about the fans.
Fair enough. Because I was going to say, Jason Tatum's one of the best young players in the league. I love what Boston's done. They've built internally throughout the draft. That is how, like, that's a way like the Pistons should be trying to build their team. You've got
Aaron, I still have dreams of Al Horford coming to Detroit in 2016 and completely changing the course of that Pistons team. I wake up with fevered sweats at night. It would have completely transformed them. I mean, you're not even talking about Blake Griffin coming to Detroit if they managed to snag Al Horford, but that's a different story.
You are not a true follower of the Detroit Pistons if you don't remember where you were when it came out that the Pistons were the third mystery team that Al Horford took a meeting with in free agency. If I was in Ohio, I don't know why I was in Ohio, but I was in Ohio sitting in the car when I saw that tweet come out that the Pistons were the mystery team that Al Horford met with and considered signing with before he ended up elsewhere. And just like the sense of like the Pistons got a meeting with this guy, it absolutely sent a ripple shot through Pistons Twitter. Back when Pistons Twitter was a little bit more of a place you might have wanted to actually spend some time on, that place was going crazy with the news that Al Horford took a meeting with Detroit. But yeah, he just a perfect guy that has succeeded so much in Boston, especially after essentially taking a year off in Oklahoma City and his rough time with Philadelphia. Like, they built through the draft. They got like a couple guys like Al Horford that they didn't draft but brought in that have really complemented their top guys well. I think Boston is a really good team, obviously, and they've been a ton of fun to watch this year. This final should be really, really good. Let's move into what we're actually here to talk about today. The Detroit Pistons in the NBA draft. We are officially in June. It is draft month. June 23rd, the Detroit Pistons will pick 5th in the 2022 NBA draft. And we've already talked about that so much. We're going to continue to talk about it as more stuff, more information, more news, more quotes come into the fold. Let's talk about, and this is going to be kind of an open discussion because we were going to talk about this potentially last week, but we said, this is a big enough topic that we could essentially do a whole show just about this. And it obviously goes back to Jerami Grant, the guy that's been the vocal point of every roster move that the Pistons have seemingly made over the past couple of years. Really, this past season and going into this offseason, there's been so much trade talk around him. The Athletic came out and reported that the Portland Trailblazers are really expected to ramp up their pursuit of Jerami Grant this offseason. We already had a previous report from Mark Stein that back during the season, Portland offered Josh Hart in draft compensation for Jerami Grant. There's a lot of talk that Jerami Grant is not only going to be traded, but that it's going to be Portland. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a discussion about what the Pistons should be doing in the 2022 NBA draft. if they were to trade Jerami Grant to Portland and acquire the 7th overall pick in the draft. So they would have the number 5 pick that they currently own. They would have the number 7 pick from Portland, and they would not have Jerami Grant on the roster. Let's not assume anything else, because all the other minor intricacies of what player comes back from Portland, or are there other players attached from Detroit, I don't think that stuff matters as much to this conversation, as much as the Pistons actually not having Jerami Grant, but having the 7th pick matters to it. So, Jeff, let's start with this. Obviously, we've talked about different prospects already. Jaden Ivey, Keegan Murray, Shaedon Sharpe. If the Pistons have 5 and 7 instead of just 5 and Jerami Grant, does that change how they approach this draft?
No, I don't think it does, but I think it changes because, look, Troy Weaver, and this is the thing I was actually about to say, this is where you give Troy Weaver a lot of credit because he's consistent. He's consistently said the price for Jerami Grant is 2 first-rounders, or it's a first-rounder and a legit rookie contract player. And if Troy Weaver just was like, oh, I'll take whatever's the best available, we're maybe talking about Cam Reddish in Detroit right now. And that is where you have to then, change up what your strategy is, because Cam Reddish, frankly, is not worth the 7th pick in this year's draft. That's for sure. So this is where you have to give Troy Weaver a lot of credit for his consistency. And no, I don't think it changes anything. I think they're taking the same guy at 5, regardless of whether they have pick number 7 or not. And they're taking the same guy at 5, regardless of whether Jerami Grant is on the roster and still plays the same position as that player at 5 or not. So for me, this does not change anything in regards to the Pistons process, nor should it. And as a fan, I think that's something you have to actually be really excited about, because God knows this has not been a team that has had consistent visions of how they're moving forward. This is not a team that's had consistent value placed upon the players in their organization. Andre Drummond, that's a great example of it. So I think for me, yes, we have talked about the players. I'm at this point, Aaron, basically where I've been trying to talk myself out of it. I've been trying to be like, it doesn't work. It's not sexy. Keegan Murray's the pick at 5. I'm at this point where I'm having a hard time seeing Jaden Ivey being even available at 5. There's been some reports that the Pistons are actually out on Jaden Ivey regardless. So for me, if I'm looking at this situation, I don't think anything changes. And I do still think Keegan Murray is the pick at 5, no matter what. Now it's that 7th pick where things get a little more interesting, because you can go a lot of different directions there. I know for me, and I think I'm speaking for a lot of other Pistons fans when I say this, I think Benedict Mathurin is a guy that a lot of people are looking at number 7. And if you're coming out of this draft, yes, down Jerami Grant, but up Keegan Murray and Benedict Mathurin, you're looking at a completely different starting 5 next year. And you're looking at a starting 5 that is young, talented, and explosive in a lot of different ways. So I think it would be really a boon for this franchise. I'm okay with Jerami Grant staying on the roster, don't get me wrong. But if that's how you're coming out of this draft with those 2 guys on your roster, I think you have to feel really good.
So one thing you mentioned is Jaden Ivey, maybe not getting a ton of love from the Pistons right now. They aren't sure about him. We did get some stuff from James Edwards III of The Athletic. Would definitely recommend that you go and subscribe to The Athletic to read his work. He does a lot of good stuff, both on the reporting side and on the column opinion side of the game. He is certainly someone he is top tier.
Is he a reliable source though, Aaron? Please, could you or maybe some other random guy on Twitter tell us if James Edwards III, beat writer for The Athletic, is a reliable source?
Yeah, that's Pistons Twitter for you nowadays. But I want to talk about Ivy for a second, because really it just kind of gives the scope of where the Pistons are at, and maybe a little bit gives you a little bit of a read into the mindset of Troy Weaver in the front office heading into the draft. They are not sure on Ivy. What James Edwards wrote was that they are, quote unquote, hot. Some guys are, quote unquote, hot and cold. So some people like them, some people don't. inside Detroit's front office. Another guy that they're not really sure about, Shaedon Sharpe. A lot of people aren't sure about him. Yes, he had his pro day, but this is a guy that did not play in college. We have not seen him play competitive basketball since last July. He is supposedly going to work out for Detroit before the draft. I don't think that's a shocker considering where he's at in terms of most of these mock drafts. Another guy that is supposedly working out for the Pistons this upcoming week is Johnny Davis out of Wisconsin. So they may be a little bit more of a mindset of the Pistons are perhaps planning to be picking a little bit later, in the lottery than perhaps number 5. So they're looking at a lot of different options. And then the other thing, some of the stuff that we've continually heard is they're very high on Keegan Murray. They like Keegan Murray. They're comfortable with Keegan Murray. Another name that has appeared in James Edwards' reporting, and another name that has really risen in terms of just being talked about.
I think I know who you're going to say.
Pistons is Benedict Mathurin of Arizona. So 2 guys that played a couple of years in college, a little bit older. They're not one and dones like some of these other guys, Jaden Ivey, another sophomore, but they're certainly not the youngest guys in the draft. They're not a Shaedon Sharpe. They're not a Chet Holmgren. They're not a Paolo Banchero. Not that the Pistons are going to have the opportunity to draft either of those most previously 2 mentioned guys, but the Pistons are looking at a lot of different names, and I think they're looking at 2 names that, in my mind, at least when they got the 5th pick, were more so options 3, options 4, options 5. I think when the lottery initially happened and the Pistons ended up with the 5th pick, the first 2 names that came to your mind were Shaedon Sharpe and Jaden Ivey. And as of now, it looks like the Pistons are looking the complete opposite way of those 2 guys. Keegan Murray certainly was the epitome of production at Iowa. Just a phenomenal showing from him in his sophomore season. He took a pretty significant leap, and 24 points a game, 9 rebounds, 40% three-point shooting. That's not stuff to scoff at whatsoever. And you could definitely see him sliding in and helping a ball club right away. But does Detroit maybe looking at guys that are maybe not as high of ceiling compared to guys like Ivy or Sharpe? Does that bother you, or does that concern how you feel this team is maybe going about building? Or are you okay with taking guys like Keegan Murray or Benedict Mathurin over some of these guys that maybe are considered to be a bit riskier, maybe have a few more holes in their game right now, or you don't know enough about them right now with someone like Sharpe? Where are you at with all that?
I think it comes down to what you're talking about when you talk about ceiling. It's what sort of ceiling are we talking about? Are we talking about the ceiling of I am the lead ball handler for this team? Are we talking about the ceiling of I am an elite player for what I do for this team? And I think about somebody like Benedict Mathurin versus Jaden Ivey. It's almost like the question of like, if you have Giannis Antetokounmpo, would you rather have Chris Middleton next to you, or would you rather have Ja Morant next to you? And I think we would all agree, Ja Morant is probably the better player, but who works better with that team? Who is still an elite player? It's Chris Middleton. You take Chris Middleton over Ja Morant if you're the Bucks. I think, at least. Maybe that's not a totally accurate comparison, since Ja Morant is all at super high level, all NBA. But what I mean by that is like Keegan Murray, Benedict Mathurin, these can be all-star level players. Just maybe all-stars in a different way than somebody like Shaedon Sharpe or Jaden Ivey is. And, one of the things I want to maybe push back, and Aaron, I'm interested to hear what you have to say about this, because so much talk about Keegan Murray versus Jaden Ivey, because I think that those are really the 2 prospects that Pistons Twitter have latched onto the most in terms of who they think is most realistically going to be taken at 5. There's all this talk about Keegan Murray not being super explosive, but then there's also this talk about him, being a late bloomer, not being so good as a freshman, really coming onto his own as a sophomore, and the questions of whether that's, more of just him getting more opportunity or if it's legit. But Jaden Ivey did the same thing. Jaden Ivey was not a star last year. Jaden Ivey was a really flawed player for Purdue last year. And I think that that's like a really weird kind of thing to be talking about in regards to both of those players, because for me, I don't see difference in that. They both were players that have flaws, and they're both players that took those flaws, worked on them, and upped their production by a massive amount. So I don't know, man. For me, I'm wondering what you have to say about that kind of perception regarding both players. Because yes, I do really like Benedict Mathurin as well. Like, I think Benedict Mathurin as a shooting guard has a incredibly high floor. I think he has the highest floor and perhaps the highest ceiling of any shooting guard in this draft. And I think that Keegan Murray potentially has the highest floor and highest ceiling of any small forward in this draft. So I don't think that even if you're taking a guy with a really high floor, then that doesn't mean you're also not taking a guy with a really high ceiling at the same time.
Well, I think we're at a point now where, and everything changes really by the day. And as we get closer to the draft, it'll change by the hour in terms of where these guys are expected to go. As of now, and I think it will stay this way, the top three in some fashion is locked in between Jabari Smith Jr., Paolo Banchero, and Chet Holmgren. Those three will be the top three in some sort of order. It's been that way for a while now. I don't see it changing. But right now, Jaden Ivey is the guy that has risen up and is becoming the consensus number 4 as of now. Sacramento still owns that pick. They're a team that's been mentioned in a lot of trade rumors lately. They're willing to move the pick. They prefer to move the pick. They'd like to get better now at a win-now player currently. They don't really have a roster that screams, yeah, we need Jaden Ivey, considering they have De'Aaron Fox and Davion Mitchell at the 1 and 2. But Jaden Ivey is at a point where it's almost like he's going to be unattainable for Detroit unless they moved up. Because I think even whether Sacramento takes him or they trade the pick, someone's going to jump up to take Jaden Ivey. At least that's what it's shaping up to look like as of now. So if that's the belief, you kind of have to, reassess where you want the Pistons to go at 5 if you were thinking Jaden Ivey was going to be the guy for them. I'm still going to have a scouting report coming out on Jaden Ivey. I've been working on it, taking a little break from it, but it's going to come out on palaceofpistons.com pretty soon. I still think if he was on the board at 5 or the Pistons for whatever reason jumped up to 4, Jaden Ivey would be the guy to take. But if the Pistons are picking at 5, let's say they have 5, they have 7, Jaden Ivey was picked 4, that's where it becomes interesting because I think personally, I would pick Benedict Mathurin next. I would pick him at 5. But if you pick Benedict Mathurin at 5, is Keegan Murray going to survive past 6 to get to 7? Is there a better chance of you might be like Mathurin more, but you could take Murray at 5 and Indiana, who has guards right now in Tyrese Halliburton and Malcolm Brogdon? Not that they wouldn't move on from Malcolm Brogdon. Do they maybe look somewhere else? Maybe get a little bit riskier with their pick because they don't want to bring in another guard, thinking they just got their guard in Tyrese Halliburton. Do they pass on Mathurin to the point where you can get Murray at 5 and Mathurin at 7? I think that's, as of now, probably the most hopeful Detroit can get if they were to add 7, because it does seem like Ivey's kind of really solidified himself as the consensus for across most, if not all, mock drafts. I'm not seeing Sharp mocked in the top 5 anymore. I'm not seeing, I'm seeing Ivey at 4 pretty much across the board.
You said top 3 is locked in. I actually don't know if it is locked in top 3. I could see Oklahoma City taking Jaden Ivey and moving on from SGA. A lot of stuff would have to happen in order for that to go down, but I absolutely could see Oklahoma City saying, screw it, we're not going anywhere right now. Or maybe even they just say, we'll pair the two of them up. But I actually don't think Ivey is necessarily even a lock for 4. I think he could go 2 or 3. So I wouldn't be shocked to see that. I also am with you. I don't think Mathurin is the pick at 5. I think it's far more likely he's available at 7. And I think it's almost impossible that Keegan Murray would be available at 7. And I do think Murray is a better prospect. I mean, can we push back on a little bit of the talk around him? Because the way I see him being discussed, and maybe I've been a little bit guilty of this as well, but having now looked at a lot more tape of Keegan Murray, I really think he is being underrated by this fan base. He's a really good defender. And this dude is super efficient, both inside the arc and outside the arc. There's really not anything he can't do other than, and this is, of course, the issue, create for others, dribbling really in the half court. That is obviously an issue for him. But other than that, and on a team with multiple ball handlers, I don't really see that being a big deal. And I think that is something that he could absolutely work on. You know, maybe in a couple of years, you're talking about him being, or maybe not a great ball handler, but having like that Tobias Harris north-south kind of dribble. So for me, I want to push back on some of what I've been hearing about Keegan Murray. I think he is absolutely worthy of a top 5 pick. And I think people that are acting like, you know, taking him there would be just kind of throwing in the towel and taking a boring, unsafe pick with a high floor but a low ceiling. I think they're completely wrong in that. I like Benedict Mathurin a lot. I'd love to have him on my team, but I'll take Keegan Murray over him. That's where I'm at right now.
I think that's fair. I've said before that I don't think Keegan Murray is the highest ceiling type of prospect that I would take if I'm Detroit, if someone like Jaden Ivey was available. But that shouldn't take away from the production that he posted at Iowa. You're talking about 24, 9, and 40% from beyond the arc at 6'8", the ability to 6'9", the ability to play on both sides of the floor. He's a capable defender. He's a good rebounder. Offensively can score inside and out. Like, immediately helps a team. So there should be no scoffing at what Keegan Murray did at Iowa or what he can bring to the table at the NBA level. I think it's fair to say there are guys that have higher ceilings. I think it's fair to say he has a higher ceiling than maybe some people are giving him credit for. You don't average 24 and 9 in the Big Ten and be an average player. Like,
no,
he's a good basketball. He's a very good basketball player. There's a reason he's being mocked in the top 5 of this draft. Like, it's a good draft in the top 5. After 6 or 7, it gets a little bit more murky. Like, if I'm Detroit, I don't really want to trade Grant to end up with like the 13th or 16th pick if Charlotte comes in the fold. Like, unless Detroit really likes Mark Williams or for some reason, like I don't necessarily know who else is in that range that's really worth trading back for.
Jaren might be there.
Maybe. He probably goes in the lottery. I mean, maybe he's there at 13, but
who knows? Maybe Sharp is there. Who knows? I mean, he could. I have no clue where Shaedon Sharp is going in this draft. So
he could either jump up or he could slide way down. I mean, he's in about as volatile of a situation as possible right now with his status.
Oh, no question. I mean, and that's going to happen to multiple guys. A name you brought up, Mark Williams. That's another guy that I am very intrigued by. I could see him kind of Scotty Barnesing his way into the top 10 over the next couple weeks. 100%. Like, I think there's a lot of fascinating prospects. I'm not in love with the idea of trading Jerami Grant for 13, 16, and Gordon Hayward. I hate that contract. I mean, Hayward is still a useful player in many ways, but defensively,
if he was he would.
Yeah, but even if he's healthy, defensively, I just don't think he fits the philosophy of what this team is. And that's also another reason why I look at Keegan Murray and Benedict Mathurin as, if you are coming out of the draft with those two guys, and this is more of what I was saying, like, here's a better example, not John Morant, Donovan Mitchell, a guy who's a little below there. If you give the Bucks the opportunity, you say, hey, you can either draft Donovan Mitchell or Chris Middleton, they're going to take Chris Middleton every time over Donovan Mitchell. Now, just because Donovan Mitchell maybe has a slightly higher ceiling as the best player on a team, that doesn't mean he has the best fit plus ceiling. And I think that those things combined matter. Just because you're saying maybe Keegan Murray doesn't have as high of a ceiling as the best player on a team as Jaden Ivey doesn't mean that he doesn't still have an incredibly high ceiling as a player that can also fit in with other star players. And I think that that is really important to look at when you have a player like Cade Cunningham on your team. Same thing with Benedict Mathurin. Benedict Mathurin can't run a team. If you put Benedict Mathurin out there and you ask him to create for others, you put him in a backcourt without another creator, he's going to struggle. But if you put him in the right situation, I think he can blossom into an absolute killer, a two-way dog. And that's another part of it I think that Pistons fans are kind of neglecting to talk about right now. Yes, obviously there is that highest true outcome ceiling, but you also have to look at a little bit below that. It's the ceiling and the fit. And I think when you look at Keegan Murray, that is a guy with a really, really high ceiling as a scorer, a really high ceiling as a shooter, a really high ceiling as a defender, maybe not so much as a creator, but if you have somebody like Cade Cunningham, if you have another star guard next to him, you don't need him to be a good creator. You don't need him to lead the team. You need him to be the best third option in the NBA. And he's maybe that guy. So for me, when I look at it, those are the type of things that you need to take into account at the same time as just looking at these players in a vacuum.
See, that's probably my biggest concern if the Pistons ended up with that 5 and 7 package of Murray and Mathurin, is the lack of creation that would, in theory, be in that starting group. Unless Detroit plans, to bring Mathurin off the bench and Killian Hayes to start again, be given the opportunity to start again, at least at the beginning of the season, and see how he performs. But in theory, you draft Mathurin, you draft Murray, you slot them in at the 2 and the 4. That is my biggest concern. Is there will be a true lack of creation.
But Aaron, people act like that's not an issue with Jaden Ivey, and like it is. Jaden Ivey was not some big assist guy. He averaged 3.1 assists last year. That's half an assist more per game than Benedict Mathurin did. So I think that the way that people are talking about those two guys in respect to their creation skills, obviously Ivey is a better ball handler. Obviously he is a better creator. Don't get me wrong here. I'm not saying that they're equivalent, but I think that people are maybe underrating Benedict Mathurin's creation skills a little bit. And I think they're maybe overrating Jaden Ivey's creation skills a little bit as well. Obviously, when you get in transition, that's where Ivey can really shine. But I don't know, man. This is where these conversations get a little too hyperbolic for my liking. You know what I mean? Where it's like Keegan Murray, somebody says, yeah, he's not a jump out of the rim athlete. And now the conversation around him is like, oh, he's, you can't slide a piece of paper underneath him on his jumper. You know what I mean? For me, it gets a little overblown. I
think there's a legitimate gap though in terms of those two guys in terms of
I agree.
And distributing. I haven't watched as much film on Mathurin as I have Ivy, but Ivy can run the pick and roll. He can self-create. He moves the ball in the offense. Not that Mathurin can't do some of those things, but I think there's a legitimate gap in terms of their playmaking, their creation abilities. But just looking at that 5-man group, Cade Cunningham needed another creator alongside him last year. And I think that's why once the 3 main guys in terms of Cunningham, Bay, and Grant were all on the floor, once they got a chance to mesh and Grant got to do some of his own creating, that's when we saw the best form of the Pistons, because every play, every offensive possession wasn't in the hands of Cade Cunningham. There was another guy that could take the ball and do something with it. Most of the time it was him doing it himself for himself. But I think there is a legitimate need for more creation alongside Cade Cunningham. And obviously the expectation is he's going to take a step, going into a second season. He'll have that season under his belt. There's that obvious growth of a young player where they take strides in different areas of their game. And if you pair a true 2 guard, instead of putting a pseudo 1 guard on the court alongside Cunningham with a guy like Killian Hayes or Corey Joseph of last season, and you take away Jerami Grant and place in another guy like Murray, who's a really good spot up guy, but isn't a creator, I think there is going to be a legitimate reason for concern. But again, that is, but I do agree with your point of it's all hyperbolic at that point. These guys would impact the team in different ways. Ivy would bring a true ability to their transition game. There's something that Detroit was not good at last year. He would be great for their transition offense. He would be great for that. He would give them athleticism, but a guy like Murray and Mathurin, they're great spot-up shooters. Mathurin has great athletic instincts. Murray's capable on both sides of the floor. So all these guys have attributes, have skill sets that would benefit Detroit in a specific way. And pointing out one guy's but not pointing out the others is essentially splitting hairs at that point, because all these guys can help Detroit. It's just a matter, I guess, in a way, of determining which areas Detroit needs the most help in and which of these guys addresses the highest number of points at the highest quality level. I do think, though, they're just the main point to bring up was that there would be some concern on my end in terms of the lack of creation if Detroit took out Grant from that lineup and brought in Mathurin and Murray. But if you have enough guys that can shoot the ball from outside, and you have guys that, who says that Bay doesn't take another step as a distributor, we saw that in the second half of last season when he said, look, I'm not shooting the ball well, but I'm going to get inside. And you know what that did? It opened up his entire game. He started averaging more assists. He started shooting the ball better from outside. He was getting looks inside. Like the talk about Cunningham getting better, maybe that will happen internally anyways, and it won't be as big of a deal.
Yeah, you brought up Sadiq Bay. That's exactly the point I was going to make. Yes, I do think that what you're saying, those are legitimate concerns. Absolutely. Like there will be concerns about creation. And Ivy, like I said, is absolutely a better creator than Benedict Mathurin. Don't get me wrong here at all. I do think, though, like you said, if a couple other guys can step up, you don't need there to be another necessarily elite ball handler, an elite passer. If you can get two other guys that pass the ball just well, and you put them next to Cade Cunningham enough so that you can at least take the ball out of his hands every now and then, I think that's really what you need. Because really, yes, it is good to put Cade off ball, but you still do want him on ball at least 55, 60% of the time, right? So it's not necessarily for me about necessarily finding another true lead guard. It's about finding enough guys that can create at a high enough level for enough plays per game to where you can offset not having the ball in Cade's hands. Is Mathurin that guy? Maybe not. Is Keegan Murray that guy? Maybe not. But we have seen it in the past, and this is a guy I brought up before, Tobias Harris. You remember when Reggie Jackson went down, they put the ball in Tobias Harris's hands and they tried to have him create. It was a disaster. And that is definitely, I think, something that could happen if you have like a Keegan Murray. But the thing is, when Reggie Jackson was in the lineup and they put the ball in Tobias Harris's hands every now and then, it worked. It's a matter of like putting them in the right position to where there's no diminishing returns. And I think if you do have multiple young guys who are improving, when you do have a Cade Cunningham, when you do have a Sadiq Bay, and then you got a Murray and a Mathurin in the fold, I think you can spread around those duties enough to where it's maybe not so much of a downside. Think something similar to like this year's Memphis team when they didn't have Ja Morant on the floor. They didn't necessarily have some great ball handlers out there. Tyus Jones is nobody's idea of an elite point guard, but they made it work because they had enough guys that could do the job at a high enough level to get by.
And remember, we have had this entire discussion really in a bubble that hasn't included the major second part of this offseason for Detroit, free agency and the trade market. As the Pistons have a ton of cap space to work with, they've been linked to primarily restricted free agents, but guys that, whether you think they're legitimate good players or not, but that upper tier of restricted free agents in DeAndre Ayton, Colin Sexton, Jalen Brunson, Mitchell Robinson. So there is more to this offseason than just what happens on June 23rd.
Wait a second, Aaron. Wait, real quick. the Pistons could use some front court help, and we're talking about how if they take these two guys, they might lack a little bit creation. So they should probably get like a center that can pass a little bit, right? But you need him to rebound too. That's also going to be really important. And, they need a little more size. Isaiah Stewart's not quite big enough. So, let's get like a bigger player, good athleticism, can finish, likes to pass. It'd be nice if he like knew the city too, right? Like already, if he had like a lot of love for Detroit. Who's a free agent that they could bring in who fits those criteria? Andre Kareem Abdul-Drummond. That's who I'm just saying, Aaron. They could bring him in. Fixes a lot of things. High post.
It would be poetic if Andre Drummond came back to the Pistons.
It'd be something. It'd be something, all right. Anyway, I'm sorry. I couldn't help but derail. You're talking about free agent big men. Honestly, no, really, I'm joking. But honestly, talking about guys like Mitchell Robinson, a little bit lower level free agents, I do think Drummond should be in that discussion. I genuinely do. He would actually, in a vacuum, fit a lot of the things that they need from a backup center.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, just imagine Drummond on the court with that roster last year. What he would have been able to do on the offensive side of the floor, running the pick and roll with Cade Cunningham. Like, oh my God, he would have leaps and bounds helped that team. I mean, we saw it with Marvin Bagley. There's no doubt in my mind Andre Drummond could have had that same sort of impact as well. Actually, I thought you were talking about DeAndre Ayton when you initially started it, and then once you started talking about the familiarity with the city, I was like, oh yeah, Andre Drummond. But we've had a lot of different names linked to the Pistons over these last few weeks. We've gotten more reports that the Pistons are legitimately interested in DeAndre Ayton. They're legitimately interested in Colin Sexton, and they're expected to look at guys like Jalen Brunson and Mitchell Robinson. One thing of note, and we've talked about Jalen Brunson before on this podcast, specifically, I think it was another show where it was just Jasper and I. We talked about why maybe we weren't super high on the idea of bringing in Jalen Brunson to this team. Jalen Brunson's father was just hired by the New York Knicks to serve on Tom Thibodeau's coaching staff as an assistant coach. He does have history in the NBA as an assistant coach. He was with Tom Thibodeau in Minnesota. So that might be something of note because the Knicks were a team that was reportedly planning to target Jalen Brunson in free agency. So that might be a guy that you're going to be scratching off of the target list for Detroit relatively soon.
Aaron, if the Knicks signed Jalen Brunson because they hired his dad, I'm buying a JD in the Straight Shot CD and a poster, a James Dolan poster, just hanging it on my wall. I'll love him for that. It does look like they're out on him. Another guy that they've been linked to, Colin Sexton. It does seem like there is talk around him where you talked about, hey, where do they find that creation? Maybe they bring in a guy like Colin Sexton to make up for that maybe a little bit of passing deficiency that they have. And maybe you're talking about Benedict Mathurin coming off the bench. He is still a pretty raw guy. You can make a lot of different things work there. So I think that there's definitely going to be moves in free agency. There's just too much smoke for there not to be fire, right?
No doubt about it. I mean, when you have the cap space that Detroit has, and again, I want to make this a point too. It doesn't necessarily just have to come via the free agent market. Like this cap space will almost certainly be used in the trade market as well.
Mm-hmm.
We've seen Detroit do that in years past. Like they're not a team that's afraid to go out and make a move via trade either. So as much discussion as we've had about the draft, there's so much more discussion that's going to need to be had after the draft about what else is going to come this offseason for Detroit, and a roster that right now is shaping up to go under drastic changes this summer. Troy Weaver seemingly has a lot in plan with one pick as of now. It's pretty much expected that they're going to have another one by draft night, and then a whole lot of cap space to work with as well. It's just there's a lot going on with the Pistons right now. This could be a drastically different team come August once these contracts with free agents have been signed. We could be looking at essentially an entirely different roster.
Yeah. Yeah, and Aaron, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, we've talked about all these different scenarios, but the fact of the matter is, there's a good chance that what ends up shaking out is none of these things, because you're totally right. They can use that cap space and they can use some of their assets to get involved in other teams' trades. So do not be surprised, even if DeAndre Ayton doesn't come to Detroit, don't be surprised if the Pistons are involved in that sign and trade to help facilitate with another team, because they can take on contracts. They have things to offer other teams. And, if a team like Portland is desperate to get themselves a big like DeAndre Ayton, even if you're not necessarily like getting the 7th pick, even if you're not necessarily getting an all-star free agent, you can involve yourself in these discussions in a way that can put you into, a totally different situation by next year for relatively low risk.
For sure. Yeah, this is a team that has a lot of different avenues they can explore. They can be a connector in the DeAndre Ayton trade, as you mentioned, or they could be the team to land DeAndre Ayton. But Jasper, I think we've had a lot of good discussion. We always go into these podcasts and we're like, yeah, let's shoot for like
30 minutes.
And then we end up doing like 45. That's entirely okay, because years ago, back when the podcast was in its most infant form, I mean, we used to do like 2-hour shows. We were clinically insane at that point. We were talking about Andre Drummond being a franchise center. That is a podcast that I will never forget. I was on it. My brother Brendan Johnson, who used to host his podcast, was on it with me. But this was before he was even hosting it. He was a guest on the show. We had, I think, 1 or 2 other people on it, and we spent probably an hour and a half talking about, is Andre Drummond a franchise center in the NBA? Is he a franchise?
Oh man,
this podcast has grown so much. It has gone in so many different directions. So glad to have you with me for this week's show, Jasper. So glad to have you on the show as always. Everyone seems to love Jasper on the podcast. Whenever I hear someone talk to me about the podcast, I was like, this Jasper guy, we really like him. He brings a lot of energy. He's kind of funny.
That's probably the nicest thing I think anyone's ever said about me. Brings a lot of energy, kind of funny. I'll take it.
About my performance in the podcast every week at this point, because I know they're not listening for me. And Mike, I love you, but they're not listening for you either. They're here for Jasper.
Oh, that's a lie. That's a damn dirty lie. And trust me, I've seen our YouTube comments. They're here for you too, Aaron. Mike, I don't know. You might be the odd man out. I'm sorry to say. I don't think anyone's here for a Cavs fan. All right, that's what you get. Once you change your loyalty, maybe they'll tune in for you too. I don't know.
Seriously, Mike, what are you doing? But okay, guys, we could go on for another hour talking about these different topics. We got to have a show for you next week, though. So I think that's where we're going to wrap it up here. We got so much more in store coming up over these next few weeks. But Jasper, great show. I enjoyed it. Anything else to add before we wrap this up?
I can't wait for next week when we have our Will Andre Drummond be the Pistons new franchise center discussion again for 2 hours.
Should Andre Drummond start over Isaiah Stewart? Preview for next week's show, folks. Thank you so much for tuning in. We appreciate your support as always. You guys have been killing it in the support of the show. So definitely continue that. We really, really appreciate you listening. If you're on YouTube, liking, subscribing, commenting, all that kind of stuff, we certainly appreciate it.
Even the negative comments, we appreciate those too.
I live off those. I love seeing people hate on me for my basketball takes. It's really consoling at this point. Thank you to Believe. Thank you to Bet Online, our wonderful sponsor. We thank you all for tuning in. We'll see you next time on the Palace of Pistons podcast.